Today we turn to Renaissance art in 15th century Italy. We will be asking a few questions. First of all, how did the classical past influence artists in the 15th century in Italy? In what way were sculptors influential at the beginning of the Italian Renaissance? What is the importance of wealthy merchants to the careers of 15th century Italian artists? And how did linear perspective reflect the growing interest in mathematical rationality?
Humanists in the Italian Renaissance considered their time to be one of rebirth. They were looking for a revitalization of their culture after what they considered to be the long, dark ages. The term Renaissance literally means rebirth, and they looked to the ancient, classical, and Roman and Greek past as their source of revitalization. It makes a lot of sense that Italians in the 14th century would be looking to Roman sources because they were surrounded by Roman monuments, architecture, and works of art. They were surrounded by sculpture, and sculpture is extremely important to the development of the early Renaissance because sculpture has a focus in ancient Rome on the depiction of lifelike qualities in the human figure and a focus on the beauty of the human form. So there's an interest in the individual, and sculpture leads the way in depicting individual characteristics. This makes a lot of sense if you think about the fact that in Roman sculpture, it was characterized by the depiction of individuals. That was part of the tradition of, it came out of the tradition of the death mask in Rome. The idea of the death mask was that people were depicted, wrinkles and all, in their individuality. This differed from Greece, where the sculpture was based on idealized proportions and the idealized human form. So a focus on the individual is a hallmark of the Renaissance. We see this interest in the individual extend also to the transformation of the personality of the artist. The artist went from being a craftsperson on par with a bricklayer to becoming an individual genius. This is a transformation that we see beginning during the Renaissance. Also during the Renaissance, there is a renewed interest in mythological subject matter, also part of an interest in the classical past. Religious subject matter is still very important, but now mythological subject matter is also added to works of art. And the church continues to be a patron of the arts. However, there are also wealthy merchants and bankers who emerge in Florence who are able to commission works of art. They do this in order to glorify themselves and to glorify God, and possibly even to win favor with God.
We see an example of a harmonious composition in the bronze relief on the right. The topic was the sacrifice of Isaac. A competition for the creation of the doors to the baptistry of the Florence Cathedral in 1401 accepted these submissions, and here you see two submissions, Ghiberti's winning entry on the right, and Brunelleschi's entry, which did not win, on the left. And why was Ghiberti's better? Well, first of all, he created a more controlled, harmonious, and choreographed composition. You can see how everything kind of fits together. There's a unity to the composition with the way that it's arranged with the mountain and the figures. Isaac is less scrawny. He's more muscular, like the classical ideal, and we see that influence here. The angel has not yet stopped the sacrifice from happening, and so at this moment, the outcome of the story is potentially unclear, offering a sense of tension and drama, which is more engaging for the viewer. In addition, Ghiberti's submission was better made. The cast is lighter, and the elements are cast almost entirely in one single piece, as opposed to several different casts, as we see in this piece. As we know, Greeks prized balance and mathematical proportion. Since man is the measure of all things for the Greeks, so balance and harmony are in relation to the human body. In the Renaissance, there is a refocus on the body. Renaissance sculpture also displayed the likenesses of individuals. Like the Romans rather than the Greeks, individual emotions and emotional intensity are depicted in keeping with this humanist elevation of the individual, a characteristic of the Renaissance, hearkening back to ancient Rome. Donatello, the artist here, was commissioned to do this sculpture that displays psychological intensity. You can see the facial expression here. He also created an equestrian statue reminiscent of the statue of Marcus Aurelius from ancient times. And you can see how much closer Renaissance artists are to the classical ideal if you compare the portrait of Charles the Bald from the 9th century. And here, Donatello depicts the nude boy David. Why is David so boyish? We know nothing about the circumstances of the creation of this sculpture, but some have argued that Donatello is showing David between boyhood and adulthood in the moment of transition. In a sense, David is the emblem of the underdog, and Florence saw itself that way, as the underdog. So a boyish David is fitting, as an emblem symbolizing their fight against tyranny. The head of Goliath here, under his feet. Donatello portrays human emotion with technical prowess. Ghiberti, who we saw a couple slides ago, gets another commission, this time for the east side of the same baptistry. He goes way beyond what he did previously in this door here, these doors. He goes beyond also what had been done previously in the 14th century. Every time we look at a work of art, we are engaging in the 4 steps involved in understanding a work of art: assessing the physical properties, analyzing the visual or formal structure, identifying subject matter or conventional symbolism, and integrating the work within a cultural context. The first thing we do when we look at these baptistry doors by Ghiberti is to identify the medium, the technique, and the size. We see that they're made of bronze and are 15 feet high. It is easier to get a sense of the size when we compare with this image of the person. So one single panel is almost a third to a half the size of a 6-foot tall human being. So they're fairly large. Next, we get a sense of the visual or formal structure. We see the shapes that Ghiberti uses. Here we see arches, and we see the arches in the pavement. We see that there is a use of perspective. He creates the receding lines of orthogonals that converge on a single point in the distance. Through the illusion of perspective, he creates a sense of space for the viewer. And this is a technical development that we will see artists employ. So you can see it a little bit better in this close-up. The way that these arches recede into space, it gets smaller in the background, and if you were able to draw lines, you would be able to create orthogonal lines that would come together at one point in the background, and that is the essence of one-point perspective. Artists developed this system of linear perspective in the early 1400s. It's a technique of illusion. Here, we will talk a little bit more about that. But as we look at Ghiberti, once again, we see that the figures do not only inhabit the foreground, but also the middle ground and the background. So there are figures in the foreground, middle ground, and background. They inhabit a space that's created by linear perspective. It recedes into the distance. And Ghiberti also uses atmospheric perspective. That is a way to convey the feeling of distance. In atmospheric perspective, in painting, colors are grayer and hazier due to the way that particles in the atmosphere begin to accumulate between our eye and the object in the distance. And he makes his objects or his figures look hazier in the background by giving them less definition and volume. And so if we're going to, so now we can turn to the subject matter in this piece, if we're going to follow those 4 steps of the art historian. What is the symbolism of the piece? The themes are biblical stories from creation to the time of Solomon. Ghiberti's work fuses painting and sculpture, another aspect of its content. And he creates a stronger relationship to painting, in fact, than sculpture, even though these are made of bronze. His work has more to do with the illusion of depth through the use of linear perspective than with the creation of sculptural volumes in space. And this leads us to the 4th step in understanding the work of art, which is to put the work in its cultural context. We've already learned that linear perspective was developed in the first half of the 15th century, not long before Ghiberti began working on these doors. And that is an important aspect of the cultural context. He is using this new technique of linear perspective that had just been invented, and he's able to innovate because he employs this technique. This theory, the theory of perspective, starts with the position of the viewer. The viewer must stand so to be at eye level with the center of the canvas. The horizon line is parallel to the top and bottom of the picture plane. You can see that here, straight across. Orthogonal lines all converge on a single vanishing point in the distance. This approximates the way we perceive space because to our eyes, objects get smaller along those orthogonals. So you can see the diagram illustrated here. Objects in the front are bigger, and as they recede, they get smaller. The accompanying diagram shows this. Perspective is the portrayal of the illusion of space on a two-dimensional plane. All of the objects are arranged in a single spatial system. Linear perspective is an example of the unity of art and science at the time of the Renaissance. Linear perspective is a result of scientific investigation. It's a mathematical inquiry. Mathematical perspective aims to conquer reality and impose order. In real life, we experience many possible viewpoints at once. We're not often fixed in one position. Linear perspective, on the other hand, fixes upon only one viewpoint. So there are limitations and advantages to linear perspective. In one-point perspective, we have one point of convergence, and the viewer becomes the center. Not only is the viewer the center, but the viewer has to be an individual. The viewer does not move in space. And not only is this viewer an individual, standing isolated in front of the canvas, but the most important aspect of the viewer, of this individual, is the head. The rational mind, then, of the viewer takes precedence. The observable world takes precedence because we're taking everything in by our eyes. So the supernatural becomes increasingly difficult to investigate through the arts because observation becomes more important. Human beings aim to control the natural world through a mathematical system, which does not allow for that which goes beyond human knowing. So they're imposing their human rational system on the world as well as observing what they see. Whereas Byzantine icons were interested in bridging the gap between the natural and the divine by bringing the saints into the room, present with the believer through the painting, the artists of the Renaissance were making windows. So you're standing in front of a window looking into the space. That's exactly what you do in front of a Renaissance painting. So learning about the emergence of linear perspective in the 14th century shows us why Ghiberti's doors are significant, since they employ linear perspective and atmospheric perspective, just as it's being discovered. And we have another artist who is able to use linear perspective in a sense as it's developing. Here's another use of linear perspective. Here it becomes even more mathematical as you see that the weapons and the figures are laid out along those orthogonals, not in a very naturalistic way, but in a more mathematical way. So we've turned to painting, and we will now look at Masaccio. He still aims to depict the supernatural, but he's also rendering the realm of the natural, so there's a bridge here. His Trinity from 1426 at the Church of Santa Maria Novella in Florence makes effective use of linear perspective. He's interested in bodily mass and three-dimensionality. So you see the use of linear perspective, that's God the Father and God the Son. And he's also making an illusion by painting the stonework, which is not actual stonework. Here we have arms forming diagonals in the composition, tribute money, the story of the tax collector asking Peter if Jesus pays taxes. So the arms become part of that linear perspective and composition. Atmospheric perspective is also visible here as the mountains recede and get hazier as you look towards the background. Things also get smaller in the background. Every line centers on the head of Jesus. And even the halos are foreshortened based on their angle. They all contribute to this sense of perspective. Botticelli created secular paintings of mythological subjects, so this is very unique. What do we know influenced Botticelli? Well, we know the Medicis, who Botticelli worked for, were Neoplatonists. Neoplatonists in the 15th century reconciled Platonic thought with Christianity. As you may know, Plato was an ancient Greek philosopher. He lived in the 4th century BCE. For Plato, contemplating beautiful bodies is the first step in the journey to contemplating heavenly beauty. Heavenly beauty for Plato is the ultimate good, so you want to step beyond the beautiful bodies to the heavenly good, but you begin with the beautiful bodies. So he wants to end in the moral virtues, beyond the realm of earthly pleasure, beyond the realm of the physical world, but we have to begin there. So for Botticelli, the beauty of Venus is both earthly and heavenly. This is Venus here, Birth of Venus. She's an allegory for Mary at the time. As people were uniting Christianity with Neoplatonism, that's an easy step to make. She has both then an earthly and a heavenly nature. She rules over both earthly love and universal divine love. This image is meant to represent fertility. The use of line is very lyrical. There's a strong sense of drawing, a drawing sensibility in this painting. Venus, the goddess of earthly and divine love, is emerging from the sea. There's also the zephyr, love, the nymph Chloris, and there are also other mythological creatures. Other mythological beings are also depicted in this painting. We've seen how humanism and the rise of the individual based in a turn toward the classical past influenced the beginning of the Renaissance. The sculptural arts led the way by looking to Greek and Roman sculpture as inspiration, and we discussed some of the philosophical implications of linear perspective. And so far, we've also looked at the importance of wealthy merchants and the patronage of art in Florence in the 15th century, particularly the Medicis. Now we will look at the 16th century and some of the names you might be familiar with, including Michelangelo, Leonardo, Raphael. And the key questions here are, how did Pope Julius II shift the artistic center from Florence to Rome? Why did artists debate the merits of sculpture versus painting, and who was on which side? How did mannerism finally become distinct from the art of the High Renaissance? With the artists we will see today, art is no longer akin to bricklaying, but artists are now creative geniuses. Artists are set apart. The idea of the artist becomes the idea of someone who is special, and this originates in the Renaissance. And let's look again at the functions of art and the themes of art that we discussed earlier in this course. So art functions to help communities form and thrive in a new environment, create meaningful order and form, explore the aesthetic possibilities of new technologies, create places for some human purpose, give tangible form to feelings and ideas, and refresh our vision and help us see the world in a new way. Now, these functions are not set in stone. These are not the only functions. We don't need to be limited by them. Every thinker will develop slightly different functions of art and themes of art, but these are general themes and functions that we can turn to if we want to think about why different people make art, different reasons for art, for the creation of art. Themes of art include the sacred realm, politics and the social order, stories and histories, looking outward, the here and now, images of daily life, looking inward, the human experience, invention and fantasy, the natural world, and art that is about art. So how can we apply functions and themes to the work we will see today? Well, let's start with Leonardo da Vinci, who lived from 1452 to 1519. The subject matter of his work is often the sacred realm. But the natural world is also important. Let's turn to the Mona Lisa. We see an example of a portrayal of a human experience, the inward experience. We've got the portrait of a woman who has a mysterious smile. So something of her inner world is communicated, even if in some ways we do not have access to that inner world, which is probably why people are so intrigued by this painting. Leonardo is also an inventor, and his drawings reveal his innovations. So in a sense, he also involves invention and fantasy in his work. He was so obsessed with engineering and his inventions that he actually neglected his painting for their sake, and he also, at the same time, was an inventor in the realm of painting. He explored new technologies and created then meaningful order and form. So he explores the aesthetic possibilities of new technologies and creates meaningful order and form to help us see the world in new ways. His paintings will describe the world realistically, but they're also creating an ideal. They fuse both the spiritual and the rational, the objective reality and the real, and the spiritual. As Sidney Joseph Friedberg puts it, Leonardo da Vinci is able to depict both physical reality and the state of the mind. Here's an example. The image of the Virgin Mary and Jesus. It's the Virgin of the Rock. Here we have Jesus, Mary, angels, and John the Baptist. Their ambiguous gestures unite them in the space. So you can see their hand gestures. Christ looks at and blesses John. He's blessing John, who prays to Christ. The angel is looking at Christ and points to Mary. Mary has one hand on John and the other hovers over Christ. There is an ambiguity to the scene here. The background is a strange rocky terrain depicted in atmospheric perspective. Here, Leonardo uses chiaroscuro, the contrast of light and dark, and displays his characteristic technique of sfumato, or smoky gradations between light and dark. He also has his highest aim, the depiction of the intention of the soul, the interior, through the expression of gestures. Leonardo was interested scientifically in an invisible substance that surrounded all things. A repetition of light and shade at once veils and reveals the forms, immersing them in a layer of atmosphere, this sense of the substance in the atmosphere. And this layer of atmosphere between the figures in the painting and the viewer's eye makes that atmosphere visible to the viewer. So he creates meaningful order and form with a well-structured composition in which the figures relate to one another in a harmonious whole with their gestures. And he also gives tangible form to feelings and ideas by communicating the intention of the soul through expressions and gestures. He gives tangible form to ideas by depicting this invisible substance that he believes surrounds all things. And just to understand sfumato a little bit, the sfumato around the lip of the Mona Lisa may in fact be the reason that she is so mysterious and hard to understand, because her expression becomes ambiguous. Hazy, if you will. As I mentioned, Leonardo was an energetic inventor and an innovator, and he used a new painting technique for this mural, a mixture of oil and tempera. And unfortunately, this experimentation was unsuccessful, and it began to crack within decades of the painting being made. But despite this failure, his use of a new technique is an example of an artist exploring the aesthetic possibilities of new technologies. All lines converge on the head of Jesus. This is a stage-like setting in which not only is Jesus celebrating the Last Supper, but he's also setting the stage for the celebration of the Mass. This painting is helping to create a space for some human purpose because it is situated in a refectory. This mural is on the wall of a refectory where monks would also be eating their meals, and so Jesus is literally setting a table in a room where monks are eating. This groundbreaking painting lets us see the world in a new way by depicting the Last Supper as it had never been depicted before. And one aspect of that is the sense of stability that we see in Jesus and movement and turmoil among the disciples all around him. On the other hand, the Mona Lisa is a glimpse of an enigmatic woman, as we have mentioned. The use of chiaroscuro, atmospheric perspective, and sfumato, which makes her so hard to determine. And this was one of his favorite paintings. So let's now turn to another important Renaissance figure, Raphael, who lived from 1483 to 1520. If we think again about the 4 steps to understanding a work of art, we can use them here. First, to assess physical properties. Second, to analyze visual or formal structure. Third, to identify subject matter or symbolism. And finally, to integrate the work within a cultural context. And first, we can understand materials and techniques. This is a painting made of oil on wood and is 23 inches tall, which is not huge. Then we can look at the formal qualities. We have bright reds and tans and blues. His images are brilliantly colored and they're dynamically composed. The twisting body of the Christ child adds to the sense of movement within the piece. We know that symbolically this piece represents Mary and Jesus. It's not just any mother and child. And finally, the last step is to put this work into cultural context, and to do that briefly, we know that Raphael paints monumental shapes that are influenced by the figures of Leonardo. The fact that Raphael is influenced by Leonardo is a relevant aspect, then, of understanding this piece. We need to know the cultural context in which the artist is working. Raphael was brought to Rome in 1508 by Pope Julius II to paint the Pope's private library. And here we have the School of Athens. And I will continue to use the 4 steps to understanding this piece, but I don't necessarily need to identify them explicitly as I discuss. You can probably pick them out for yourself. We're looking at a fresco. It is 19 feet high, and it's situated on one wall of the Pope's library. It's a painting that has a sense of classical balance. It says a sense of monumentality. There are the bright colors and cohesive design, use of linear perspective that is created through the use of the painting of the barrel vaults. The space is harmoniously designed with a balance of different colors, and there are figures grouped within it. But who then are the figures? Let's turn to subject matter and symbolism. It's called the School of Athens because famous Greek philosophers and scientists are depicted in it. They're both ancient Greek philosophers. At the center, the 2 most important Greek philosophers are Plato and Aristotle. And let's get it close up here. Here they are. They are gesturing in a certain way. Plato is pointing to heaven, while Aristotle is pointing to earth horizontally. These gestures refer to their philosophies. Plato advocates the contemplation of ideals, so he's pointing to heaven. Aristotle, on the other hand, believes that we must put virtue into action, into the situations on the ground, on the earth, so he's pointing horizontally. Universal truths for Aristotle do not exist apart from the particulars of actual life. These 2 simple hand gestures are heavy with symbolism. They carry so much weight and meaning. Finally, in terms of cultural context, we know that Pope Julius II holds humanist values. These values inspire an investigation of classical and philosophical text. So Raphael depicts figures then from classical antiquity because of the Pope's desire to study and communicate humanist values. Pope Julius II creates a new golden age and makes the artist at the center of his project. The artist becomes the center of Italy and Rome, and the artistic center moves from Florence to Rome. The Pope gathers the best artists to enlist them in his project, and in doing that, he also pulled in Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel. The Pope actually forced Michelangelo to do the work. Michelangelo paints the Sistine Chapel at the same time that Raphael is creating the School of Athens. And to understand a little bit about why Michelangelo was so resistant to painting the Sistine Chapel, we need to go a little bit deeper into the history. Michelangelo saw the power of sculpture as the power to make man. So for Michelangelo, here's an example, and here's another example. he considered the creation of sculpture a godlike activity. In a godlike fashion, he not only imitates reality as in a painting, but he brings reality into being. He's very aware of his ability to kind of make things a reality, and he's not afraid to use art to glorify himself. So with the Pietà, he actually broke in the middle of the night after the sculpture was finished to sign his name across Mary's sash so that no one would question whose piece it was. He was a very young man when he made this piece. Like the Greeks, again, man is the measure of all things, and Michelangelo's goal, in a sense, is to glorify man and not God. But at the same time, we know through his poetry that Michelangelo was a very devoted follower of Christ. So this is fusion of humanism and Christianity. In this piece, there's a disregard, actually, for accurate proportions in favor of more emotional potency. The hands and the head are actually pretty disproportionately large. Because, and in addition, that is true here. Because what's important to Michelangelo is the composition. So sometimes proportion is less important than the composition. So, for example, Mary is supposed to be holding Jesus, but Jesus then is actually much smaller proportionally than he would be as a grown man, but that is for the sake of the meaning and the composition of the piece. So Mary is much larger, and the folds of her dress are much larger, but you don't get a sense of it being inaccurate because the meaning holds true. So he broke with this need for mathematical proportion. The eye was more important to him. The artist's eye could find the right proportions rather than math. So the artist and the artist's judgment become elevated. In Greek and Roman art, the human body was the ideal. And here, there's certainly a turn to the individual like never before. But instead of measure, there's an expression of emotion. Michelangelo was himself a dramatic personality. He was full of power and grandeur. David is both the unique and both the antique ideal of the male nude. David expresses both the antique ideal of the nude male and also an emotionally charged image. He has a knit brow. That means he's looking at the unseen foe, Goliath. He has a tense readiness, ready for the dangerous moment that's about to happen. And if you contrast him to Donatello's David, you see that tension. The muscles tense. Donatello has already accomplished the task. David's about to, and you get that sense of tense muscles about to do something great. Michelangelo painted the Sistine Chapel in 4 years. It's 128 by 45 feet, and it depicts the creation, the fall, and the redemption of humanity. And there are 300 figures in the Sistine Chapel. It is as if the gods of Mount Olympus came down and became actors in the story of God's action on earth. You can see how muscular they are. So they are reminiscent of the Roman ideal and Greek ideal. The figures are important in themselves. The image does not create a picture window into a space. So he's not really using perspective in the background. He's more of a sculptor, plopping his sculptural figures down in a space. He does use some perspective, but the sculptural figures and their volume is most important. It's not as if they inhabit a real space. It's really about sculpture. So in fact, this is why Michelangelo does not want to do the Sistine Chapel at all, why he doesn't want to paint it. Because he believes that sculpture is the better art. Leonardo debates this idea. Leonardo argues that sculpture is little more than a mechanical activity, and sculptors are little more than laborers. According to Leonardo, sculptors' art requires more physical exertion than the painters, which is a more intellectual endeavor. And sculpture is then more mechanical and entails less mental effort. The sculptor does not have to create the illusion of shadow, which creates volume in a painting, because the sculpture is lit already in nature and casts shadows already. So sort of an advantage makes it easier. So he's arguing that painting is more difficult. And you can decide what you think, whether sculpture or painting is the better art. Or maybe they're just different. Mannerism is a reaction to the classical ideals of the High Renaissance. Mannerism builds on those ideals, but in it we see an artificiality, a grace and an elegance. This is a contrast to the ordered, balance, and lifelike references that were hallmarks of the High Renaissance. Strange colors, unconventional compositions, attention to technical virtuosity, and the pursuit of beauty for its own sake distinguish mannerism. Here is one of those strange, irrational compositions. Where are the ordered columns and rational ordering of space through linear perspective? And yet, there are references to famous works by the previous generation, including, for example, the Pietà. You see the resemblance here. Madonna of the Long Neck is what this painting is called. Her large legs and skinny neck are disproportionate. She's sitting but on an invisible throne. Again, Christ references the Pietà, and the Virgin also has a band across her chest. The allegory of Venus and Cupid by Bronzino is an aestheticized work, and it's quite strange. It's not meant to seem real, but rather to show off his skill as a painter. His figures have few emotions that they express. The sexuality is explicit, but also refined. It's intense and yet cold. Cupid is shown with his mother, Venus, engaging in an ambiguous, unexplained sexual act. She has the apple of discord, and Folly is throwing flowers at them. Kronos and Truth pull back the curtain to expose their act, and there's a male victim of syphilis here. In all, this may be a critique of illicit sexual sins. Complex allegories like this one fascinated the intellectual elites at the time. They loved to try to decipher these strange paintings. As is often the case in this period, few women could get training that they needed, or they were not allowed to travel to take commissions in order to become artists. But northern Italy did have quite a few female artists, and even university lecturers. Some women learned from their husbands. This artist, Anguissola, was unusual because her father was not an artist, but he was a humanist. And so he gave all his children an education, and even contacted Michelangelo on behalf of his daughter, asking him to give her assignments and critiques. She painted portraits and miniatures. In this lecture, we have seen how humanism and classical Greek and Roman art and philosophy influenced art in the Italian Renaissance. We've seen how the role of the artist changed during the Renaissance. Art becomes a calling, not just an occupation. And we've seen the development of linear perspective and mannerism. We saw how Pope Julius II brought renowned artists to Rome, making Rome, rather than Florence, the artistic center. We saw how Michelangelo scorned painting, even when he did paint. Even though he didn't want to do it, he was forced to do it. On the other hand, Leonardo argued that painting was better than sculpture. Michelangelo saw himself as a godlike figure. He glorified the human body as the Greeks did, but he didn't do it with the same emphasis on mathematics. Leonardo, for his part, painted both psychological depth as well as accurate depictions of material reality. We've also remembered the themes of art and the functions of art and performed the 4 steps to understanding a work of art, identifying material and size, formal aspects, symbolism, subject matter, and cultural context. It turns out the Pope's projects needed funds, and in order to fund the rebuilding of St. Peter's, Julius II and popes after him sold indulgences. People could pay for their relatives to get out of purgatory by buying these indulgences, and this practice actually helped facilitate the Reformation. Luther rejected the idea that it was possible to pay for the forgiveness of sins. Only through faith in Christ are sins forgiven, according to Luther. We will see how such changes impacted the art of Northern Europe in the next lecture. Then, when we turn to the 17th century Baroque period, we will see how, in Italy, the Catholic Church responded with the Counter-Reformation. renewing its patronage of the arts as a way to engage the emotions of the faithful.